Hello everyone and welcome to the Writers Book Club podcast. I'm Michelle Barraclough and each month I take a deep dive with an author into the writing craft and process behind one of their books. Today we're going to fly south together all the way to Port Fairy in southern Victoria to pick the brilliant mind of the writer Jock Serong. If you haven't yet read Jock's latest novel Cherrywood, I envy you because I'd love to go back to the beginning and rediscover the mysteries of this clever, beautiful tale all over again. Cherrywood is Jock's seventh novel and it's quite different to his other novels in so many ways except for one, the writing. Because the writing, as always with Jock's work, is stunning and he's so articulate on the subject of his craft. I know you're going to get a lot out of this episode. Let me start by telling you what Cherrywood is about. We begin in Edinburgh in 1916. A rich Scottish industrialist, Thomas Renfeather, impulsively embarks on a mad scheme to build a paddle steamer out of dubiously sourced European cherrywood on the other side of the world in booming Melbourne, Australia. But nothing goes according to plan. Fast forward to Melbourne in 1993. Martha is a clever, lonely and frustrated lawyer. One night, on impulse, she stops at a strange pub in Fitzroy, the Cherrywood, for a bottle of wine. The mysterious building and its inhabitants make an indelible impression and she slowly begins to deduce odd truths about the pub. From the multi-award-winning author Jock Serong comes a darkly delicious, playful and rich novel about legacy, community, wonder, love and reinvention. Cherrywood is haunting, magical and a true original. And I couldn't agree more. Cherrywood is pretty unique, as you'll see when you read it. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Jock. Jock Serong is the author of 7 novels. Quota, which won the 2015 Ned Kelly Award for Best First Fiction. The Rules of Backyard Cricket, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Victorian Premier's Award for Fiction and several other impressive awards. And On the Java Ridge, which won the Colin Roderick Award and internationally the inaugural Staunch Prize in the UK. He's also won praise for his trilogy of historical novels, Preservation, The Burning Island, and The Settlement, which have won or been shortlisted for several prizes, including the ARA Historical Novel Prize, the Historia Award for Historical Crime Fiction in France, and the Voss Prize. Just one other thing before we jump into the chat. You'll notice that I don't start with an introduction. That's because Jock and I were already talking about the book and I said, oh, hang on a sec, I'll just press record since we're talking anyway. So it kind of sounds like it's starting in the middle of a conversation, but it'll all make sense as we go along. Please enjoy my chat with Jock Serong. So I finished a couple of days ago and I couldn't put it down towards the end. I was saying to my family, fend for yourselves. Got to finish this.
Oh, that's lovely. Thanks. I felt very fond of that ending. I was really enjoying myself towards the end. And I felt like I finally knew where everything was going and it was making sense to me. So I'm glad that it felt that way. Yeah, particularly near the end.
Yeah, you can feel that on the page, actually, your excitement towards the end.
Right.
I was trying not to, because the writing is also so beautiful, I was trying not to race through it to get to the end. I was trying to force myself to slow down because is this a spoiler? I don't know if I'm allowed to do spoilers, but I'll just say this, the final journey along the Yarra River back to Port Phillip Bay, so beautiful. And I grew up in Melbourne, so all those landmarks were very familiar and dear to me. So I felt quite nostalgic.
Oh, nice. It's interesting, I've been doing a bit of screenwriting over the last couple of years, and it's interesting that difference between what screen people want and what you can do in a novel, which is principally that when you're writing for screen, everything has to gallop towards dramatic points all the time. The pacing of it is vital. And some parts of Cherrywood, I felt like we can just sort of meander around in little circles here, and it's okay because we're in a world and the world's fun. It was great not to have that pressure to get somewhere. So, yeah, I think somewhere near to where that journey down the Yarra starts, I was really thinking that way, like just let these characters have some time in the rain and let the thing work itself out.
I'm still there. I'm still on the river. We've started the interview and I haven't even said hello and introduced
Hello.
you. So welcome to the podcast, Jock Serong.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Michelle.
You're welcome. We've just jumped straight into the chat. But can you take us back, Jock, to the beginning? I would love to know where all the various strands of this novel sort of came from, all the inspiration, what you drew upon to bring this novel to fruition.
Well, there's lots of different things. One of the early influences was that I had spent, I don't know how long, 5 or 6 or 7 years writing a trilogy about Tasmanian history. And it was very heavily researched, and it depended a lot on me consulting with First Nations people and taking extreme care with accuracy. And I'm glad that all of that happened that way. But after it was done, I really did have this overwhelming urge to just make up a story, kind of a reflex to go the other way. And in doing that, I fell back on the things that I like to read and the things that I read as a kid, and tried to find some of those imaginary worlds and to think about why they were so compelling, to think about what the writers were doing. Um, so I read, while I had COVID a couple of summers ago, I read Oscar and Lucinda in a tremendous hurry and with a raging fever, and it was almost hallucinatory, the experience of doing it. Before that, I had read The Master and Margarita, the Bulgakov novel, and Susanna Clarke, who wrote Piranesi.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
and all of those novels, have in common that they expect you to let go at various points. Whether you would formally call that magical realism, I don't know, but there is an expectation that the writer has set up that you are going to part ways with reality at certain points. So those things were bubbling away, and going back to childhood, the Brothers Grimm used to absolutely terrify me and delight me. And a lot of those stories, that they are fairy tales, I guess, in the genre sense, but a lot of them end very badly, and they always have a moral point. And I felt like coupling that moral sense to the kind of hallucinatory experience was somewhere where I wanted to go. Um, and then the other influence, I guess, was Port Phillip Bay, thinking about it's, compared to Sydney Harbour, it's not an exotic waterway. It's not spectacularly gorgeous. In fact, it's very hard to see it in an overhead sense. It's just a big flat dish. But I grew up around the edges of it and spent a lot of time. I remember winter weekends when my mother would work night shifts and our father would take us to the beach to puddle around looking under rocks. And there was this spot at Beaumaris called Kiefer's where you could find fossils, and that found its way into the novel as well. So all of those things, I think, I had piled up in a big heap on the desk, and then started to ask myself about, okay, what's the connective tissue between all of these very disparate influences? The last two ingredients were bits of my working life, which were working in Fitzroy pubs when I was studying at Melbourne Uni, and then working in the glass boxes in the city as a commercial solicitor, which I sort of did a couple of times for fairly short stints. But it was enough to get a very strong sense that this was not a career that I wanted to practice in the long term. I certainly won't now.
No. And you can feel that on the page, definitely, your experience there with all of those elements. But the legal sections, this is someone who's actually been in the bowels of a legal practice, a corporate legal practice.
Yeah, I think that's the right organ.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you brought up Piranesi, because as the novel progressed, that was a novel that came to my mind.
Oh, good.
And then there's a bit of an influence from Enid Blyton in there as well. She seems to just be an innate part of all of us. She's in our bones, people of a certain age, isn't she?
Yeah, that's right. And when I was thinking about Faraway Tree, that was something that I looked up. I didn't look many things up, but I looked up the Faraway Tree in the hope that people had thought about what it represents in psychic terms.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, there's reams and reams of research about what Enid Blyton was up to, in a psychological or in a mythological sense. and what those novels tell us. And so that meant that I had my little psychotherapist character, Bird, and he was able to talk to Martha a little bit about, here's a way of thinking about what you're experiencing, this notion of a cardinal tree that rises from the everyday into the clouds. That's really what the Cherrywood as a hotel is doing. It's coming up off the ordinary bluestone streets of Fitzroy and entering another realm. And it's a place where she can escape what disappoints her about life. I think that's part of why she's so drawn to the hotel. It's Joey to some extent, but it's also the possibility of there being another life.
I loved all those little Easter eggs, like, the references to the Faraway tree and, well, for Melburnians, lots of little Easter eggs in there, references to different places. The other thing, and I don't know if this was conscious or not, but calling the law firm Caspian reminded me of the Narnia books.
Oh, you've nailed all of these. It's definitely the case.
Was that a case? Oh, okay, good. Okay, I thought, am I just completely, am I clutching at straws here?
No, you're quite right. And to take that a little bit further, I remember one of the books in the Narnia series was called The Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Yes.
And there's a little bit of Dawn Treader in the paddle steamer, I think. So, yes, there was that, and there was the idea that the Caspian Sea sits really at the fulcrum between two worlds. And also it felt like a version of very old, dark Europe that I really wanted to evoke.
Yeah. And you've also got the time standing still element, spoiler, I think, but I will put a spoiler alert at the start of this, but that whole...
I think that one's safe.
And there's a character called Lucy.
Yes, and she comes from a whole range of sources. There's Oscar and Lucinda. There was a paddle steamer called the Lucinda, which I think I mentioned in the novel. I can't remember now, but one of the constitutional conventions that, this is me nerding out, that brought about the Australian Constitution in the 1890s was held on a paddle steamer called the Lucinda. And there's a beautiful Nick Cave ballad called Lucy. That just felt like the right name for the job for lots of reasons.
Yeah. And I think Martha, as, coming from Caspians and in the novel, Prince Caspian, he becomes the champion of the oppressed. And that's really what Martha becomes in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this is a great reading of
it. Sorry, I'm going down rabbit holes here, but it was so fascinating.
That's exactly what you hope people will do as a writer, isn't it? You really want people to find the rabbit holes. Yes, and I hope that in Martha there is a little sense of righteous fury about the things that she's seeing. She's a little bit unfiltered at times, which was a fun thing that I found with her along the way. That, for instance, she blurts out on that dreadful corporate retreat, she blurts out her opposition to what they're talking about, and then is a bit surprised at herself for having spoken up. But yeah, that she looks at what the law firm is doing with its various cases, its various jobs, and she's disgusted and a little bit trapped, because ethically you are trapped. You've got to do your job, which is perhaps why she lashes out.
There must come a realization at some point. Did you have a similar sort of realization when you were working in law, that it just wasn't for you? Or?
Well, I was in law for 17 years or something. And I think along the way, I found various ways of doing things that accorded with, hopes and conscience. I worked with asylum seekers a lot of the time. I worked with Aboriginal people on native title claims and a royal commission. And along the way, I tried to hang on to those sides of what felt good to me about being a lawyer, but it gets you in the end, particularly if you're in a firm setting. Every year you become more senior. Every year you are charged out at a higher rate, and that means that every year you're pulled more towards types of work that make more money. And that, coming into middle age, that process is almost inescapable. And hats off to anybody who can find an ethical path through it. It's not easy.
Yeah. I love the fact that Martha, who initially on the page, she's working for this big law firm, and there's that whole concept of characters can be unlikable. But then there are all these indications to show that she is not like that. She doesn't want to work in insurance. She wants to work in the human rights division. And then slowly over time, she just sort of peels away these layers and gets to know her true self. And that's when you really begin to love her as a character. And I love that in novels where you get to see a character, the layers peeling off them and get to see inside who they really are.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Michelle, because I think, you know how sometimes when you're writing a character, you're not sure what's happening to them until you're quite a way down the road. And I think looking back at Martha, what was going on with the storytelling was that as her career closed off its various options to her, and the Human Rights Department was obviously this mirage that got further and further away from her, that her reaction to that was to turn in on herself and to ask herself, well, who am I really? And could I do better? Rather than these bastards have let me down. That's really what impels her to start walking the streets, searching for the pub, trying to save the pub. All the other things that she gets tangled up in are the result of her, I think, asking herself the hard questions. And you can never see that, as I say, as you're writing. It turns up afterwards, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit more about that process of writing. So you've got all these ideas. How does it then roll out as a first draft process for you, or in this particular case with Cherrywood?
Well, it's funny. I was talking to some students yesterday and they said, how long did it take to write this book? And I always think that you know when it finished, but you never know when it started. Because for me, I start with images and I start with the image I can see most clearly. And when I feel like I'm really happy with what that image is, I'll write it as a couple of pages and put it in a folder that's marked so I can find it. And then I'll write another one and another one and another one. And this is in between lots and lots of other things that we do as writers, some of which are pretty workaday and pretty mechanical. And when you get those moments, you grab another bright image and eventually there's a pile of them. And as I was talking before, you start to think about the connective tissue. And depending what the novel is, some novels, I think, for me, then require some planning. So I'll kind of build a chart of how the story will unfold and where the chapters will go and how the characters move through it. Other stories, I don't do that. I just follow my nose. And here I was mostly following my nose. And I think sometimes when we have those discussions about whether a writer is a plotter or a pantser, I think that may be slightly the wrong question. I think each individual story makes that demand of you as a writer rather than it being inherently what your character is as a writer. This is my seventh novel, and I think some of them I have planned really carefully, and some of them, as I say, I've just wandered through them to see where they go. And this was much more one of those. So I had a few things early on. I definitely had that scene of Martha in a taxi stopping at a pub in Fitzroy on a dark, rainy night and the weirdness of what happened in the room. I had that. I had some little scattered thoughts about paddle steamers and a handful of pretty verbatim memories from being a commercial solicitor. And those were the things that I kept first. And then once you've got them firmly down, I feel like they start generating other images and other scenes, and hopefully off you go.
So that first image that you talked about that came to you that you then jotted down, that was Martha in the taxi on the dark, rainy night in 1993?
Yeah, that's absolutely the starting point of all the storytelling. Everything works out backwards and forwards from there.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know how a lawyer on a dark, rainy night in Fitzroy in 1993 sends your brain going to the early 20th century in the early 1900s to a Scottish heir and his paddle steamer dreams.
Yeah, I really hate to say that I'm not entirely sure.
That seems entirely in keeping with this novel, by the way.
Yeah, I think what was happening was that at any given time, I'm carrying around 3 or 4 different ideas about stories, and I am at the moment. And one of the thought processes when you get stuck is, okay, maybe I'm looking at this wrong, and maybe this story belongs inside this other story. Maybe they're not two separate stories, but they can be woven together. And here, I think I was thinking about paddle steamers because I was thinking about Oscar and Lucinda. And I worked backwards to, all right, a man has a crazy dream to build a beautiful paddle steamer. Who is the man? Where has he come from? Why does he want to do it? So you interrogate yourself, and that makes you work backwards, so that I got all the way back to realizing that he needed to be an orphan. Why is he an orphan? Because his parents died, leaving him huge amounts of money. How did they die? They died as a result of their own impetuousness, or at least his father's impetuousness. Could that be something that the child reacts against and becomes a careful, conservative person? So unlike Martha and the Dream and the Pub, which is really has a dreamlike quality about it, I think Thomas's story is fairly carefully constructed step by step.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's actually, thank you for describing that process. I know it's not always easy to describe what is an intuitive process as a writer. Talk to us about the structure. So that then becomes a dual timeline structure, doesn't it? Did you have any idea for how that would be structured before you started the writing? Like as you were gathering all these different snippets, did you go, oh, actually, this is going to become a dual timeline?
Again, I think that's a thing that you can see more clearly in retrospect than you can see as you're heading towards it. I knew that I had what I called the old story and the new story, and I knew that the two needed to converge, and that the converging point was the timber, that there's something about the timber, whether it is sentient or whether it's cursed or what's going on with it. It is what joins these two timelines. So initially, I thought, okay, I'll write the old story and then I'll pick up the new story, and it can be a 3-act structure where the old story is act 1 and the new story is Martha, and that's acts 2 and 3. And then kind of loosely, act 2 is Martha's kind of quest, and act 3 is where Nan starts to take over. And that was the way I presented the manuscript to the publishers. That was kind of what I thought was the finished structure. And then it was an editorial suggestion that we chop up Act 1 into its constituent chapters and thread them through Acts 2 and 3. So that what that means, importantly, it's not just kind of being modern for the sake of it or being stylized. What it does is it means that the reader meets all of the characters at once at the front of the book, so that hopefully the reader is interested in all these people and what they're up to, and also has this tantalizing feeling of these chapters are radically different. How are they going to pull together? And that you are drawn towards that converging point. It's risky because if the chapters are too jarringly different to each other, then the reader gets confused and puts the book down and picks up the phone. And the show's over. So it's one of those aspects in which you've got to work very, very closely with your editors and ask them how those transitions between the two stories are working, whether they're too jarring. Because often you can't see it yourself. As the writer, you've got the whole world in your head and you know where it's going, but the reader doesn't yet.
Yeah, it's hard to get that distance, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. I
like a novel that makes me work a little bit. And I think a lot of readers do. It's funny because I was thinking, oh, there's the historical timeline and the modern timeline. I'm like, actually, no, 1993 is now historical. Michelle, that's 31 years ago. Come on.
Terrifying.
It's horrifying. Yes, terrifying. But I think you very cleverly have these little clues throughout both timelines that tell us, stick with me. You will be rewarded for this. And then you really are. You know, the fact that the boat is in the older time frame, Zimmermann and Thomas are talking about the wood, and it's cherry wood from a cherry tree. And the pub we know is called the Cherrywood. So we're sort of starting to make those connections. So you know that they're going to be linked. And I think, just because the writing is so fantastic, you want to stick with it.
You reminded me of a thing that I had forgotten about, which was that years ago, very, very hot summer day, I went with a couple of mates and we drove west out of Port Fairy into the farming country and drove through a farm and had a surf and just baking sun and, everyone's sandy. And on the way back, there was a very, very old pub sort of on the corner of a paddock, which is now derelict, but it's called the Yambuck Hotel. And I went into the Yambuck Hotel and bought a single long neck of beer, which we were planning to lug down on the rest of the trip home. And when pub gives you a takeaway bottle in one of those long, narrow paper bags.
Yeah.
The long, narrow paper bag had written on it, The Fisherman's Arms. And the guy behind the bar put the bag on the bottle. And I said, "That's not here. What's the Fisherman's Arms?" And he said, "Oh, it was a pub in Port Fairy that burned down. We just happened to get a box of their bottle bags." And that sort of led me on this weird little quest looking up the Fisherman's Arms and what happened to it. And that took me into 1970s Port Fairy and this bizarre story where John Denver and Lee Marvin went fishing for great white sharks off the coast here in 1975. It's the germ of the idea about the paper bag, and the first clue that Martha gets is that the name of the pub is written on the bottle bag.
Yeah.
I think that's why I was going there. But to go back to your earlier point, I think the biggest difference between good fiction writing and bad fiction writing is the business of crediting your reader with intelligence. I think fiction is awful when it assumes that everything needs to be explained. The reader is galloping along, making connections and querying assumptions and testing little theories for themselves as they read. And to outline and elucidate everything is to wreck that fun.
Yeah.
So somewhere there's a happy balance where you keep dropping breadcrumbs all the time, but you also don't make the connections so that the reader has the pleasure of making them.
What Charlotte Wood was talking about when she wrote Stone Yard Devotional is she said, "I don't want to hold the reader's hand anymore."
No, absolutely.
Yeah, let them work.
Yeah, and we read the reader that you want is a reader who loves reading and reads a lot, and they become very, very discerning over time about how they like that narrative to unfold.
Yeah. So tell me a bit more about the characters of Thomas and Martha and how they evolved, and maybe getting into a bit more of that sort of craft aspect as well. I mean, you're writing down these notes as you go, images that come to you, but then we all know the craft and the process that a character has to go through. Is that something you're aware of when you're writing, or does it just develop as you write?
Yeah, I think it develops as you write. And I don't know if it sounds pretentious, but you are literally trying to get to know this person who you're creating. So I don't think it occurred to me that there were significant parallels between Thomas and Martha, again, until I looked back at them. And the main one is that both of them have arrived at a point in their lives where they've essentially got what people want, but they've arrived there and found it to be hollow. So Thomas has inherited a vast amount of money. He has a lovely wife and a beautiful little child. And he's positioned to do almost anything he wants, but what he wants more than anything else is to have earned it. And he hasn't earned it. And that's the bit that really gnaws away at him. And the reason why he's so susceptible to a dodgy approach from Giminon is that he desperately wants to be somebody who came up with a scheme and saw it through and reaped the rewards rather than simply being handed money. Martha, slightly differently. Martha is somebody who's strove as a student diligently to be in this very, very elite, successful company as a lawyer. And she's achieved that. And she's got there and looks around herself in horror and thinks, is this really all there is? So both of those characters are at a point where they're very, very open to reinvention. And that's why they both go off on these quests, Thomas to build his paddle steamer and Martha to track down this wandering pub.
Do wish that Thomas had have decided to write a novel or something, rather than this. Oh, he's just not a very good judge of character, is he?
He's not. And there's that tiny little clue that I dropped very, very early on that Thomas was a wonderful kid, but his only fault was that he was a little bit too trusting, which his parents thought was a good fault to have, which you can understand.
Yeah.
Only until it heralds disaster.
Yeah. And had he been born maybe 100 years later, his wife Lucy may have felt a little bit more inclined to pull him up. I mean, she tries to,
yes.
but...
Yeah, and that was something that I hoped people would pick up, was the idea that Lucy quietly is making all the right judgments while Thomas is making the wrong judgments. And that the one time she tries to directly challenge him about that, he knows she's right, but he decides to play the card, which is the Times, which is, I'm the husband here and this is the decision I've made. And she meekly accepts that. And I hope that's a realistic depiction of what would have gone on in marriages at that time.
Yeah.
And of course, that particular decision is the worst of all decisions for Thomas.
You're very good also at making characters multi-layered. I mean, Lucy is not just what a typical woman of that time period you might think to be, a socialite, not very well educated. On the other hand, she is extremely well educated. She's an engineer and architect. All throughout this novel, you're kind of subverting these cliches with the characters.
One of the things you just reminded me, Michelle, about Lucy is that Lucy, even as a child, she has this capacity for drawing, for draftsmanship. And I think I talked at some stage about the man in draftsmanship is the whole problem here. But that she's unable to live out her life as a practicing architect, and that her daughter receives the same gift, that she's a wonderful drawer, and that likewise she never actually makes something of that talent. And the idea of what it means to be born with a talent that is never explored or exploited, whether that's a tragedy or whether in fact all of us are born with a range of talents that we'll never practice, and why we have that talent and where it goes. Yeah. I think those are great human mysteries.
Yeah. Although some of us work as a lawyer for 17 years and then find our innate talent and go with that.
I can certainly say that law wasn't my talent, which is pretty clear.
You did well to stick at it for 17 years.
Why, thank you.
I'm very curious too about the point of view with this novel. So the first novel I read of yours was The Rules of Backyard Cricket, which is different again and also different to the three historicals that you've written. But I just went back and had a look at the beginnings of all of those novels, and mostly you've started with either dialogue or action and you've thrown us straight into those. But with this novel, again, you've taken this different approach. Each timeline begins with a sort of omnipresent voice, zoomed out, I think of it as, and then we plunge into the character's deeper point of view. It's sort of this, here's the world, now come closer and let me tell you a story. Is that something you deliberately did with this novel? I loved it.
Well, I love that as a description. In part, that was deliberate, and the deliberate bit was the Thomas story, that I wanted to sound a little bit like the way Dickens sounds, or the way someone like Pushkin sounds, where it's quite mannered and you are speaking to the reader. I want you to get comfortable. Have you got a drink? I want to tell you a story about a man, and there's a particular thing about this man that you need to know before, as you say, we devolve down into the dialogue and the action. That was very deliberate because I wanted that story to sound historical and to sound different to the contemporary story. Taking your point about the fact that 93 is no longer contemporary.
We're calling it the old and the new, people. Keep up.
Yes. And then I'm not doing that with Martha, I don't think. But at some point also those rhythms are subconscious and I don't really see them other than that little deliberate bit that I've referred to.
Mm,
I wonder if all of us do that as writers. I don't know.
I don't know, but it was very obvious to me. And then looking back, because I knew we were going to have this chat, I thought, did I imagine that? And then I went back and read the start of the Thomas section and then the start of the Martha section, and you do it in both. Can I ask you to read a
Yeah.
little bit? I was thinking chapter 1, obviously, maybe just the first 2 paragraphs, just to give an
Okay.
idea of the tone.
Thomas Albert Renfeather was a man unusually exposed to fortune. Generous and charming, he won the affection of everyone he met. He grew up the only child of a wealthy Glasgow family, surrounded by love and comfort. He found schooling easy, was a graceful athlete and a friend to all. He was funny enough and mischievous enough that the tearaways saw him as theirs, but somehow studious enough never to cross a teacher. If he had an obvious fault, it was that he was too trusting, but his parents believed it was a good fault to have. Thomas's father, Malthus, was an industrialist, though the coarseness of the word does no justice in explaining the lightness of his touch. He could persuade people like few others, bankers, employees, his family, so he could vault from scheme to scheme, some succeeding, some quietly foundering, with such agility that the family's wealth built steadily over the years, and his reputation floated above reproach.
So that is the start of the old timeline. And then would you read the start of chapter 5? So this is the start of the new timeline, which is Martha's story, Martha's point of view.
One rainy Friday evening in the winter of 1993, a taxi swept through the streets of East Melbourne on its way from the city to Richmond. That year was one of the few remaining when a great deal was known of the world, but not yet so much that the world had become overknown. Small gaps remained. The taxi driver had greeted his passenger with a faint nod through a slit of open passenger side window. His head was a river boulder, heavy, and so devoid of the ordinary distinctions between flesh and bone, it seemed entirely hard. His skin was slightly dark, his hair trimmed short, his nose crooked like a boxer's, and although he was clean-shaven, his stubble announced its imminent return in the form of a darker shadow. His passenger, a young woman, noted these things in the seconds it took to open the rear door and lower herself in. The driver didn't turn to her, but she saw enough of his face in the mirror to find something softer in there. He watched her. She watched him. Her name was Martha.
So can you see the similarities? I mean,
can now. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I don't think I did at the time, but I see what you mean.
Yeah.
And I know that I really wanted to make that point about 1993, about it being really the last year, I think, before you could simply Google stuff. And obviously that's very important to what Martha goes through, that it's necessary for her to embark on this very manual, very analog quest. She needs to look up microfiches and go through books and study paper maps.
Yeah.
All of that fun would have been wrecked if you could Google it.
Yeah.
So yes, it's just before the world became overknown.
And not having mobile phones either. So the communications aspect is less of an issue with this novel, but certainly when they want to get in touch with each other, it's quite different to how it is now, where you just pick up a phone and send a text or whatever.
Exactly.
Like a few weeks would go by between her seeing or calling Joey, and you think, why doesn't she just, that's right, it's 1993. She's just going to text you.
Yes, and you spent, in relationships, in crushes, you spent a lot of time wondering what the other party was thinking rather than simply hitting them up.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. It took me back So with those sections, and particularly with the Thomas section, it does go on. We learn about what happens to Thomas's parents and then Thomas's schooling and becoming an adult, and it's quite descriptive. Do you ever get any pushback from editors who say, given the way your other novels have opened, straight bang into action, into dialogue, with this one, it's got this lovely bit of telling at the start of the section.
Again, it's a really good observation, Michelle. It's deliberate in the Thomas section because, again, I felt like it echoed the types of old literature that I really enjoy, the Dickens stuff or the Russians, people like that.
And Jane Austen.
And Jane Austen, where telling was okay.
Yeah, that first sentence, Thomas Albert Renfeather was a man unusually exposed to fortune. It's very much a man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It has that almost that similar kind of flow to it, doesn't it? That syntax.
Beautifully observed. I may have stolen it.
You are the Jane Austen of the 21st century, Jock.
I think for some reason we have made it a cardinal sin to tell.
Yeah.
And I think if you're conscious of what you're doing, it's that old thing about knowing the rules and breaking them. If you're conscious of what you're doing, telling can be fine. Here, I deliberately stepped away from dialogue, at least at first. The back half of the book is much more dialogue driven as Nan explains to Martha a lot of what's gone on in the world. But again, that's just exposition. That's just Nan setting out the hows and whys of everything that's gone on. And I suppose I could have done that without the inverted commas. So it's probably a horses for courses thing. A novel like Backyard Cricket is much more action and dialogue driven. And part of that might have to do with being in the first person as well in that book.
Yeah. Jock, I wanted to talk to you about this idea of place as character. It's bandied about a lot, but I think your novel really embodies that.
I think it was one of the very early ideas here that places were going to be really important.
Yeah.
Obviously the pub, because the pub is a character in the literal sense that it appears to be sentient and it appears to have motivations, unlike most other places. That, I guess, extended to the paddle steamer because the paddle steamer is not a passenger ferry. It's not a commuter vessel. It's an experience. So I got to think about, okay, what would these people have loved if it was to be an excursion? They would love to have good food and musicians and art and for things to look elegant. And there's that lovely feeling as the writer of wandering around inside this space that you're starting to visualize, and you can see what's below decks and what's up on the roof and what's out on the deck. And that was a great pleasure, I think. The commercial law firms, I still have very strong memories of the way those spaces operate. And at one stage, I talk in the novel about the capacity of those rooms to soak up sound, which I always found oppressive. It's a little bit like being in a recording studio or the deepest parts of a library where you instinctively whisper because that's what the space is doing to you. The sound just falls dead and you can't hear the conversation in an adjacent room ever. Where else? The shipyard, that was reminiscent of those weekend days fossicking on the foreshore that Port Phillip seems to do a very good line in slimy intertidal flats, and
True.
That they have a particular smell about them and a particular look. So yes, I spent as much time, I think, conceiving of those places as I did thinking about the characters, which is not always the case. Sometimes where the drama is very tightly between the people, it doesn't matter so much what stage you've got them on. They can just be, in someone's house or walking in a park, and it doesn't matter a whole lot. But here it really mattered.
Yeah. You just brought everything to life. Is this a love letter to Melbourne, do you think, Jock?
I think it is, because I've been gone from Melbourne for 20 years now.
Yeah.
And I think that's about the right distance to write about a place.
Yeah.
things get thrown into much sharper relief over time. And I love going back to Melbourne. I'm going back there this afternoon. And I always look forward to doing Melbourne things when I'm there. Whereas I think when I lived there, I was caught up in the everyday and probably not as sharply tuned to what was interesting about the place. And what I love about Melbourne, and I talk about it in the novel, is that attempt to impose order on the landscape. So the designers of the city laid down a grid, and the grid is a mile by half a mile. And what I didn't know until I wrote the book was that the grid of Fitzroy is the same size.
I did not know that either. That was fascinating.
Yeah. And also the fact that both grids are tilted to take account of magnetic north. So I had in mind that you could look down Burke Street at sunset and that the sun would set at the end of Burke Street because it pointed west, but it doesn't. It points to a slight cant so that you can never see the sunset.
Huh.
Those things are really, the little mysteries of a city. Yeah. And late in the writing of the novel, I started thinking really hard about Calvino and started turning my thinking towards his ideas about cities and about how cities overlay themselves, and that any given city is in fact millions of cities because it's the product of every individual experience of the city. So anyone who lives in or walks through Melbourne has their own Melbourne rather than there being one unitary entity. And once you think of a city in those terms, the possibilities for the things that are hidden in it become so much greater. So that's what was going on with that depiction of Melbourne. The idea that there could be aqueducts going through the city rather than tram tracks.
I loved that.
Is just toying with the different possibilities of Melbourne. It was great fun.
I loved how Martha, she's aware that she doesn't want to burst Joey's bubble as he's describing this dream.
She does.
She does. Because I always think of Melbourne when I think of it, and I think the place that you grew up is you have that nostalgia for things that happened in each of its parts. So, go down Chapel Street and that's that nightclub where I met that guy and we listened to that song, or that's, Luna Park where I went to with my brothers when we were little. But I remember Fitzroy because I never lived in Fitzroy. I lived in Richmond, but I had a boyfriend who lived in Fitzroy. And so I'd completely forgotten until I read this novel that I used to go over and stay at his place. And then there was this whole other landscape of cafes and bars and antique shops and vintage stores to discover. We used to go to this cafe called Rumbarella's. It was just quirky. There was sort of art on the wall. And Fitzroy always felt to me to have this kind of edgy, cool glamour that Richmond did not have. Richmond was like a bit grungier, workmanlike.
Yep. Oh, I really agree with that. And I had grown up in the southeastern suburbs among a lot of sort of mid-century cream brick houses, and Fitzroy was a place you looked at as where cool lived.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something else you just reminded. Oh, that's what it was. One of the ideas for the Moving Timber pub was that I once in my uni years went on a date at a cafe called Cafe Bohemia that was on the upper end of Brunswick Street. And it was this beautiful shop front that had lots of timber framing in the glass. And inside there were a lot of indoor plants. It was kind of a bit of a jungle. And we were seated inside a huge fireplace that had an ornate timber mantelpiece on it. This tiny little table for two that was inside the fireplace. And I remember thinking it was just the most magical structure, this cafe. And the minute I went looking for it again, it wasn't there, which must have been the start of the thinking about the pub. Someone told me later on that it burned down, which in retrospect seems entirely logical. It was a pretty radical looking timber building, but funny where these things start.
All these things from your subconscious have kind of bubbled up into this novel.
Yeah.
Got that.
Yeah. And I guess as writers, we can encourage that process, the bubbling process, and we can train ourselves to be receptive to it over time. It's hard to do because we tend to think in very deliberate, structured ways, as you've got to do. But if you can let the percolating have its way, sometimes you find the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to read a little bit from the novel about St. Kilda because I feel like this is a really good example of the beautiful descriptions that you have in here. Um, Thomas often walked along the foreshore early in the day, threading behind the backs of the two structures, theatre and amusement park, that fronted the esplanade. It meant he didn't have to suffer the shocking cosmic joke of a giant mouth ingesting and disgorging tourists as the tramcar rattled past its row of shingle teeth. I love that description of Luna Park. You don't say Luna Park, but that's Luna Park, right?
That's an fact. That mouth is. I used to be terrified of it as a kid.
Same, same.
It's a little weird.
And then I didn't realize this Turkish Capola. Yeah. When you described that, I was like, yes, I've never thought of them as being Turkish. You know, you say the cream dollop white of billowing dresses in the sun, cumulus against the husband's dark suits, parasols and extravagant sun hats, children in sailor suits and bonnets, posed rigidly for the man with his camera, a high wire in the holiday sky, the barometric drop of collectively held breath as a couple ant-pick their way across, a merry-go-round, brass poles, and painted horses. So beautiful.
That passage comes from, I think, on the Centre for the Moving Image Archive website. There's some black and white movie reel footage of Luna Park in this era, I think around 1920. And it's only sort of 3 minutes of footage. And I just watched it over a few times and then piled down all the words that it summoned. And that's what created that little passage.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Your descriptions of the minor characters too, I feel like you're a real genius at this. You've got this ability to describe a minor character who might only be on the page for a chapter or less, and you can just see them instantly.
Well, of course, you're under less pressure to build them a backstory.
True.
They don't need to have parents and children and siblings. You can think about a characteristic that you've noticed in somebody that you think is fascinating, and parlay that into their identifying characteristic in the story. And I think it's true of life that our kids talk about what's the term, main character energy or non-player characters, which is a sort of horrifying idea that certain people in their lives are of no consequence. But the people who occupy small roles in our lives every day, we tend to pick up and memorize by a distinguishing characteristic. And I guess all I do is look for that. The smoking nun is probably a bit more than a minor character, but that thinking applies, that she's constantly on the gaffers and she is a hardworking, good-hearted, community-spirited person who grinds away day after day on behalf of other people. And that's there deliberately in contradistinction to Martha wanting to work in the Human Rights Department, which has all these, sort of grand implications to it, but ultimately comes to bugger all. Here's a woman just going to work every day and cooking stuff and cleaning up to help other people.
Just even the fact that the cigarette's constantly kind of hanging out of her mouth just gives you that mental picture, doesn't it?
She's kind of ashing in the lasagna.
Yeah. And Martha's boss, the lawyer, Brandon the man, in just this one sentence, he calls his secretary Toots. And you're like, yeah, that just pretty much sums him up.
I agonised about how to spell Toots because on the page it sort of appears as Toots.
Toots.
And I thought, I hope no one thinks that's Toots because it's definitely Toots.
It's Toots, yeah. I think in context.
Right, good.
I did just want to give one quick example, which is with Bird. So you talked about one identifying trait that just sort of sums up the person, and you do it beautifully with Bird. So you say, Bird wore a loose linen shirt that made him look relaxed, bohemian. Martha could see the thinness of his chest where the shirt draped towards its buttons, the chest of a sullen guitarist. You can almost cast that man, can't you?
Well, this is the thing, that if you just summon, and I guess for this context it needs to be a male, but if you summon a male guitarist to mind, They're always a bit pigeon-chested.
They
I don't
are.
know
They
what that
are.
is. And they always wear loose shirts because they're guitarists.
Yes, exactly. I did just want to ask you about the editorial process. We have the magic, well, we're going to call it, for want of a better word, the magic realism. We have the old and the new time frames. There's
Yep.
a lot in there. How did the editorial process roll out?
Well, a few things to say about that. The first is that I had published 6 novels with the one publisher, which was Text,
Mm.
and that this is the first novel with HarperCollins. So the processes were very different. Where Text was cradle to grave with the one editor, the marvelous Mandy Brett, and she and I understood each other very, very closely and did all the different phases of the editing, just changing hats really and going through the lot. At HarperCollins, I've moved through a series of different people who have different skill sets, and some of them you don't meet physically. They are on the end of an email. All of them were excellent and incredibly helpful. Before the manuscript got to HarperCollins, I had been through a few rounds with my agent, who is a former editor. And I think one of the most encouraging things that she pointed out repeatedly was what she called fly your freak flag. Um, I'm probably a pretty conventional person. I'm not very good at being weird. And Melanie's constant encouragement was reach for the weirdness. Don't pull back. You don't need to be rational here. If it feels good, chuck it in. It can always come out later. And that was just such good advice. So I really tried to let go, so that by the time HarperCollins got their hands on the manuscript, there was all this mad stuff in there. And it was fascinating the way various editors bounced off the mad stuff, that sometimes they would ask very logical, pointed questions like, yes, but how could this happen? And sometimes they were right. I needed to find a way of explaining how it could happen. Other times the decision was, no, we're just abandoning logic here. We're just going for it. So those discussions were always really fruitful. And I think one of the interesting differences between us as writers and readers is that you often get asked by readers, is it awful having somebody poring over your work and crossing things out? That readers tend to see editing as a kind of corrective process or a punitive process. And my experience of being edited without fail has been that it adds enormously to the work and that it's a wonderful contribution, and that the person editing you isn't there on a power trip to try and cut you down.
Yeah.
They're there to try and find the good stuff that you're also reaching for. It's cooperative.
I think that'll be really useful for new writers who haven't been published yet to hear as well, that it's more collaborative rather than corrective, because it can be a bit.
Oh, it really is. I think editors are amazing people, and that there's a generosity of spirit in climbing into somebody else's story and looking for what works well and trying to encourage that part of it.
And you need it by the end of a novel, don't you? You need somebody who can just say, right, I can't look at this thing again. You need to look at it now.
You're so right, Michelle. I remember once having a discussion with Mandy where I had been agonising over the final stages of a manuscript. And I said, I'm just not sure when to give it to you. And she said, are you just moving commas around now? And that's exactly what I was doing. I was pulling a comma out and then putting it back in.
It's time.
Time to hand it over. Yeah.
Jock, what did this novel, last question, what did this novel teach you about writing?
That's an interesting question. It did, because they always do. And I think sometimes people forget that this is a job and that we're all learning on the job. I feel like every novel I find out new things that I can try. And funnily enough, I think you make the job harder for yourself, because the minute you get on top of one thing, you decide to set some other ridiculous challenge for yourself. And it winds up every bit as hard as the first one was. I think this novel in particular taught me to dispense with the idea of genre. I think genre is someone else's problem when you're a writer. It's the agent's problem, it's the publisher's problem, it's the bookseller's problem, but I don't think it's the writer's problem. I think instinctively the story works or it doesn't work, and that if you've got even the faintest glimmer that the story is going to work, then you latch onto it with both hands and you go for it. And someone else can decide if it's literary or commercial, or even if it's magical realism. I'm still not entirely sure that Cherrywood is magical realism. So you let go of those categories and just follow the instinctive currents in the story to their conclusion. The other thing that I don't know if Cherrywood taught me this or if I'm still wondering about it, but the world is in an awful, awful state at the moment. And I've written a story about a non-existent pub 30 years ago that wandered around Fitzroy. And I wonder how that works as a writer's response to the world, whether there is a place for people to be doing this when the world's on fire. And, there are explanations you can come up with, like we desperately need escapes at times and that we can't always rail away about dystopias. But equally, there are times when it feels frivolous to do it. If you've got the advantage of a platform, if you've got someone who will publish you, then is it right that you use that platform to tell a nonsense story? Maybe it is right, and maybe there are important reasons why.
Absolutely. I know we've talked about emerging writers, but I have a lot of experienced writers with lots of books under their belt who listen to the podcast, and some of them from our discussions, not on the podcast, but I know that they are worried about jumping genres, or their publisher won't let them, or they think their publisher won't let them. But you're saying feel the fear and do it anyway?
Yes. I would have thought that as an artist, you make the art that sings to you, rather than thinking about what the shape of the hole is and trying to make the peg that goes in the hole. I think that is far too self-conscious, and it leads to unimaginative decision-making.
Write what you want to write, basically.
Spot on. Yeah. Thank you. Short version. Yeah.
Short version. Jock, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation, and I'm really looking forward to whatever it is you're writing next.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. I've really enjoyed it. And thanks for all the thought you've put into that. It's been wonderful.
There you go, the wonderful Jock Serong. One of my favourite parts of that conversation was listening to Jock talk about how he took that handful of ideas and inspiration and converted them, if you like, into a story. I found that so fascinating, and I've never heard it explained quite so well. So really, really loved that. You can find Jock at his website, jockserong.com. And of course, you can pick up a copy of Cherrywood wherever you buy your books. And I strongly recommend you do. I think this novel will teach you so much about what can be done with your fiction. I've also put both those links in the show notes for you. Okay, up next on the podcast, we have an author whose work spans non-fiction, historical fiction, commercial women's fiction, children's novels, and a picture book. She is the internationally published award-winning author of 23 books. I'm speaking of the incredible Anita Heiss. Anita's novel, Bile Yara Dangalangdare, is one of my favourite novels, and talk about the power of fiction. That novel taught me so much about Indigenous and colonial history. I'd go so far as to say that every Australian should read that novel, and I really hope it's being studied in schools. We are going to be discussing Anita's latest novel, Dira Yawada. But I really want to chat to Anita about writing in general. I always try to end the year with a really prolific author because they are just so practiced in the art and craft of writing, and Anita fits the bill perfectly. Let me tell you what Dira Yawada is about. It's set in Bathurst in the 1820s. Mina was a young girl when the white ghosts first arrived. She remembers the day they raised a piece of cloth and renamed her homeland Bathurst. Now she lives at Cloverdale and works for a white family who've settled there. The Nugents are kind, but Mina misses her Miyagan. His brother, Windradine, is a Wiradjuri leader and visits when he can, bringing news of unrest across their Ngarambang. Mina hopes the violence will not come to Cloverdale. When Irish convict Daniel O'Dwyer arrives at the settlement, Mina's life is transformed again. The pair are magnetically drawn to each other and begin meeting at the Billa in secret. Dan understands how it feels to be displaced, but they still have a lot to learn about each other. Can their love survive their differences and the turmoil that threatens to destroy everything around them? The Guardian said, Diriyawadda is full of heart and hope, truth-telling and history, and shimmers with language too. It sounds fantastic, doesn't it? And I know Anita has put her heart and soul into this book. So you know the drill. Grab a copy of Diriyawadda wherever you buy your books or use the link in the show notes and send me in your very best writing questions for Anita. As always, I'm giving away a copy of this month's novel. All the details for the giveaway will be over on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you once again for joining me this month. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you would share it with all your writer friends. And if you would care to leave a rating or a review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen, that would also be amazing. Thank you. As always, I'm recording on the beautiful, unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I'm lucky enough to live and work. I look forward to catching you next month. Until then, happy writing.